September of 1969 is probably one of the most hated months in the history of music, because it holds the day in which John Lennon held a meeting to announce that he wanted a divorce from the Beatles. Even if you weren't around back then, like myself, just thinking about all the albums that we never had because of the breakup still hurts. But I think we have to agree that when you explored the discographies of John, Paul, George, and Ringo, you realize it wasn't all that bad. And if you're like me, you even start to see the breakup of the band as a positive thing. Now I know that only by saying that I already kicked myself out of the Beatles fan group. I know that the breakup for a lot of you was the saddest and most tragic thing that ever happened in the history of music, but for me, I see the positive side. I see all the incredible albums that John, Paul, George, and Ringo made. You have some of the most incredible albums from the 70s, 80s, and the 90s, and in the case of Paul McCartney and Ringo, they're still releasing music today. Then there's also the fact that after 1967, after the creation of Apple, after the death of Brian Epstein, and after the release of the White Album, the Beatles were no longer really a band. They were more individual artists releasing songs and albums under the name of the Beatles. So a 1973, 1972, or even 1971 Beatles album doesn't really sound like the greatest of ideas to me, and that's the reason why I wanted to make this video, to show you the greatness of their solo discographies, and to do that, we're going to be looking at their debuts, because in my opinion, those are their best albums pretty much. Now, doing a full timeline of their activities in the early 70s is not really my thing. I'm just going to focus on each Beatle individually, and of course, we're going to start with Ringo.
No. No, if you do it that way, it's like hanging yourself by your arse.
Now, I love Ringo. You love him too. Look at this clip.
Of course he can talk, he's a human being, isn't he? Well, if he's your grandfather, who knows?
How can you not love that guy? He's the actual cute Beatle. He's also an incredible drummer and a really good artist. The problem is that his discography is probably one of the worst things related to the Beatles out there. Let me tell you, you have some horrible albums. Most of them are really bad. He actually just announced a new album. I haven't read anything about it. I'm hoping that it's going to be a covers album, because if it's not, Lord Almighty save us. And the beginning of his solo discography isn't really all that different, because you have two covers albums, Sentimental Journey, filled with a bunch of traditional pop and jazz songs, and then you have B Cups of Blues. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing, by the way. Leave it in the comments if I am. I have no idea how to say that. That album is pretty much the same as Sentimental Journey, but instead of jazz music, you have country. And I know what you're probably thinking. John Lennon has a covers album, Paul McCartney has multiple, so why is it wrong for Ringo to do the same thing? Well, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just that it's incredibly boring. Ringo is not really known for his talent as a vocalist or his beautiful singing voice. Actually, his voice is so deep and so hard to, harmonize with, that one of the main problems with his discography is the fact that it's him singing the songs. It goes without saying that these albums are horrible and don't really represent the beginning of his career as a solo artist. For me, that honor goes to his 1973 self-titled release, Ringo. A lot of people think this album is really special because it's the closest thing we had to a Beatles reunion, and I can definitely see that. I mean, you have songs by John Lennon, Paul McCartney and Linda, and George Harrison in this album, George being the main contributor. I think he participated in more than half of the songs in this one. Actually, the intro for this album, I Am the Greatest, was written by John Lennon, pretty evidently so, based on how the melody sounds and how Ringo's voice is produced. And he even provides backing vocals for the song, backing vocals that sound so clear that it almost feels like a duet. Then you have good old George in songs like Devil Woman, Photograph, Have You Seen My Baby? And of course, my favorite Beatle couple, Paul and Linda McCartney, providing backing vocals for the song 6 O'Clock. You have catchy and playful songs all over this album, including that one where Ringo sings about a lady that's 16 and also really beautiful. It's a really hard one to explain when I show this album to people. And I know that I'm going to get a lot of people going like, oh, you're just a kid. You don't understand. It was normal back then. Listen, buddy, I don't really give a fuck. That's weird. But overall, this is an incredible album, and it was bound to be, because of all the incredible musicians that worked in this album, including the rest of the Beatles, and it's even better if you get the bonus edition. You get some of the singles that were actually written only by Ringo Starr, so yeah. There's really nothing else to say about this one. I don't want to waste too much time on Ringo because we have some really interesting albums coming up next, so yeah, let's move on.
Dirty rumor. Philosophy on your part. Was it?
Just a rumor, yeah.
Yeah.
I think Paul used to get them all with his,
When it comes to George Harrison, we have some really interesting ways of manifesting his dissatisfaction with the Beatles in the form of the Wonderwall album and the Electronic Sounds album in 1968 and 1969. These albums are kind of questionable, especially when it comes to Electronic Sounds, because in the case of Wonderwall music, I think it was a good way for him to let go of his Indian classical music face. He was able to dump all of his creativity and artistic needs into that album, and I think that helped him, grow and evolve into songs like Something, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, and Here Comes the Sun. George was really infatuated with Indian culture in 1966 and 1967, and I think that was kind of blinding his artistic lens and was not allowing him to grow as an artist. So I think that Wonderwall music was a really important album for him. But when we're talking about Electronic Sounds, I don't really understand the purpose of the album. I get it that he was trying to play around with a Moog or Moog or Moog synthesizer. I don't know how to pronounce that word. I get it, you were trying to see what you could do with it. The problem is you made it into an album. No one cares. You were constantly complaining about not having enough room in the Beatles discography to release your own songs. Now you have the chance to release a solo album and you do this. That's a questionable decision, at least. I think a lot of people doubted him when he put out this album, but that was only until he released the one that actually serves as his true solo debut, All Things Must Pass, in November of 1970. Explaining you the greatness and the shock factor of this album is almost impossible. No one was expecting an album like this from George Harrison. Of course, people knew that he was an incredible songwriter because of songs like Something, Taxman, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, but a triple disc rock album with some of the best songs from 1970. The original release of this album was an hour and 46 minutes long, and there's not a single song in this entire thing that I don't like. My Sweet Lord, Isn't It a Pity, I'd Have You Anytime, If Not For You, the wonderful guitar playing of Behind That Locked Door. And you know that an album is good when the production is really, really bad, because let me tell you, Phil Spector did a horrible job with this album, but even then the songwriting and the performances are enough to make this album a masterpiece. I know that a lot of you will probably get mad at me because of what I said about Phil, but the volume in this album is all over the place. The drums are barely even relevant to any of the songs in this album. Sometimes George's voice, which is the most beautiful thing in this entire album, how he dances through the notes with such flow and ease. The way that he performs with such levels of passion, it's almost inexcusable that his voice is so far back in the mix in a lot of these songs. And this wall of sound technique that Phil is known for, that involves all these volume and overdubbing and reverb, sounds great in albums by the Ronettes and in some of the Beach Boys albums too, but I don't think it fits George Harrison's songwriting style that's so based on melody, and not really arrangements and compositions. I've thought about this album in a much cleaner and acoustic fashion, and I think it would have been 1,000 times better, but even the way it is right now, I think it's still one of the best albums from the 70s and one of the greatest albums of all time, actually. This album and the sophistication of his songwriting and the beauty of his performances showed people that George Harrison was a songwriting powerhouse. Even though this album kind of ruined his entire solo discography because every new release was seen as a failure compared to All Things Must Pass, I still believe that this album is one of the best things that came out of the breakup of the Beatles, and I believe it's clear evidence that George Harrison was in fact underestimated by John Lennon and Paul McCartney.
They think your haircuts are un-American.
Well, it was very observant of them, because we aren't American, actually.
True, that.
True.
Now let's go with John Lennon, and I have to tell you, things are a little more complicated here, because John does not only have 1 or 2, but 3 experimental albums released prior to his actual debut. I have a whole video in my channel talking about the unfinished music trilogy by John Lennon and Yoko Ono, 2 Virgins, Life with the Lions, and the Wedding album, but even though it's my video, don't go and watch that video unless you want to hear this. We're talking about some of the most annoying, boring, meaningless, and stupid minutes in the history of music, so even if you're a John Lennon fan or a Yoko Ono fan, I don't think you should listen to these albums. But if you want like a small example of what these albums are like, in the album Life with Lions, for example, you have a live performance by Yoko Ono, a terrible live performance, by the way, in the first half of the album, and then the second half is basically Yoko Ono having a miscarriage, so that's kind of how these albums go. The first album, 2 Virgins, is basically John Lennon recording how he cheated cheated on his wife. And the third album, the wedding album, is like a mating ritual where John and Yoko call each other's names and then you have a press conference. So yeah, that's what these albums are like. Don't waste your time. It's not even music, honestly. So given the fact that he released some of the worst albums ever made in the beginning of his solo career, the one that actually works as his debut is probably not that good, right? Well, you're completely wrong, because in my opinion, John Lennon's Plastic Ono Band is one of the greatest albums ever made and one of the most influential albums of all time as well. A lot of people have this weird idea that because John was the one who broke up the Beatles, he didn't have a hard time come to terms with the fact that he didn't have his bandmates anymore. But that's not really the case at all. It's very well documented that John Lennon was having a really hard time in the late 60s and in the early 70s, which is one of the main reasons why he enlisted on the Primal Therapy, which is basically a practice where you reenact moments of your childhood or any particular time of your life where you weren't allowed to express your feelings properly, and then you express those feelings either by screaming, crying, or doing whatever it is you feel like you need to do. In John Lennon's eyes, the sessions were incredibly effective, and that's the reason why he decided to use that same concept to make an album, and that's the reason why Plastic Ono Band is such a devastating album. I don't really want this video to be that long, so I'm not going to go through each and every single one of the songs, but I have to tell you about a few of these to explain the nature of this album, because the intro, Mother for example, is one of the saddest and most tragic and impactful songs in the history of music in my opinion, because of the sheer violence and the sheer pain and suffering that you can hear in John Lennon's vocals. From the moment the song begins, you can already tell that this is going to be an incredibly dark album because of the funeral bells, because of John Lennon's eerie vocals, because of how silent the entire song sounds. You know, there's not a lot of instrumentation. Everything sounds raw, almost like a live performance where the only performers are the drummers and the pianist. Then, as the song continues, John stops paying attention to the melody and focuses only on the power and passion of the vocals. And when I say power, I don't really mean belting or any other vocal technique to make your voice sound louder. I mean pure yelling, screaming, and pain. And dude, I've heard some creepy albums from the metal genre and from people like Diamandagalis and Lingua Ignota, but the pain and suffering that John Lennon exhales in this song is one of the most disturbing things I've ever heard in my life, and it elevates his performance to new levels that I don't think anyone else in the history of music has ever reached. Once again, I've heard a lot of music, but the level of pain that filters through this song is something so incredibly unique. But pain and suffering is not the only feeling that you'll find in this album being accentuated. Disappointment, alienation, solitude is also found in a lot of the tracks here, like Isolation, like Working Class Hero. And of course, desperation and frustration and anger in songs like I Found Out and Well, 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 songs that are only there to give John Lennon a platform for him to scream and scream until he can't scream no more. The instrumentation in this album is very minimalistic, the guitars sound sharp, the drums sound dry, and allows you to put all the focus into the performance, which is the main catch of this album. John Lennon's vocals have this reverb to them that I don't know if it's just me, but it makes me feel like I'm listening to a mystical version of John Lennon, like his soul is the one singing the songs. I know it's a silly way to see it, and I'm not even religious, but that's literally the feeling I get every time I listen to this album. And this album was not only amazing, but was also incredibly influential for people like Nirvana, people like Patti Smith, people like Iggy Pop and David Bowie. You know, all of these artists were influenced by the darkness and the dryness of the record, how the instrumentation was very minimalistic, but it packed a huge punch. The political statements made in this album in songs like Working Class Hero, Isolation, and of course, God, you know, a song where he basically denies not only Christianity, but every single religion out there. There's a lot of things I want to say about this album. I'm definitely going to make a video on it someday, but for now, believe me when I tell you that this is one of the most tragic, sad, and impactful experiences that music has to offer, one of the greatest albums of all time, one of the most influential albums as well, and the genesis of John Lennon as a solo artist.
Come on, baby, my little darling, want to drink with me? Come on, honey, maybe we'll go back to my flat.
Now it's time to go with my favorite Beatle, the one and only Paul McCartney, and his self-titled album released in 1970. Paul was a little bit different from George and John. He didn't have anything ready. He didn't have any plans of making anything outside of the Beatles. He participated on a soundtrack with George Martin, I think. I don't remember the name of the film, but that's pretty much the only thing you have from Paul McCartney as a solo artist prior to the Beatles breaking up. So when John announced that he was leaving the band in September of 1969, Paul didn't really know what to do, so he went went to his farm in Scotland with his wife Linda and went through a really tough time. Actually, he had a couple of mental breakdowns and was allegedly battling depression because he didn't even know if he wanted to continue with music outside of the Beatles. Can you imagine Paul McCartney, one of the greatest songwriters of all time, not releasing any more music after 1970? That would have been a tragedy. So if you're a fan of Paul, the first thing that you have to do when you wake up is say out loud, "Thank you, Linda McCartney." This beautiful and majestic example of a woman is the reason why Paul McCartney decided to do McCartney 1, Ram, and Wildlife with Wings. Because even though you and I can agree right now that McCartney 1 and Ram are incredible albums, the critics back then and even the rest of the Beatles did not agree. They didn't like the albums at all, and they were very public about it too. The reason why, to be honest, I have no idea. McCartney 1 is one of the albums I've heard the most in my entire life, is one of the most influential albums from the lo-fi genre, and it's one of the first times that an artist performed every single instrument in the album. Of course, prior to McCartney 1, there were folk albums and blues albums that only featured one person as well, but this is a rock album, so you had drums, bass, acoustic guitar, electric guitar, and piano. And then the vocals, which is probably the best thing this album has to offer. They can be powerful in songs like Ooh You and Maybe I'm Amazed, one of his best ballads. They can be beautiful and tender in songs like Teddy Boy and Junk, and they can be melodic and rhythmic in songs like Every Night and Man We Was Lonely. And I know that a lot of people argue that this album sounds unfinished and that it wasn't properly recorded, because it wasn't. You know, Paul McCartney was not only responsible for the instrumentation and vocals, but also the production, the recording, and the mixing of the record, which is probably the reason why the drums have this silky-like texture that takes away a lot of the percussion power. Actually, the bass sometimes sounds even louder than the drums in a lot of these songs. Then you have the fact that the guitar playing is dry, sharp, and, you know, it doesn't really sound as melodic as McCartney's melodies, you know, so there's like a disconnect between the two. And the vocals, you know, sometimes McCartney is a little too close to the mic, as you can see in songs like That Would Be Something and Every Night. But I would say that the imperfections this album has make the album feel more intimate, you know, like you were there with McCartney recording the songs, producing the songs, mixing everything together. And I would also argue that the homemade quality of this album is what made it so influential, because it showed that you don't need a huge production team to make an album. You know, you don't need a lot of budget to create beautiful music, because even though this album has quite a few flaws when it comes to the production and the recording, this is still a beautiful album with some of its most beautiful songs, like the ones I already mentioned, Maybe I'm Amazed, Junk, Teddy Boy, Every Night, Man We Was Lonely, The Lovely Linda. You know, such a beautiful and cute way to start a song. As a matter of fact, I think that if I had the power to go back in time and tell Paul, like, hey, listen, man, let's call George, let's tell him to produce this album, let's add some lyrics and melodies to this instrumentals you have right here, and then let's go to EMI Studios and record the songs properly, I wouldn't do it, because I love the way the album sounds right now. I would love to talk about Ram in this video as well, but that was like the evolution of McCartney, and we're only talking about the debuts. So for now, believe me when I tell you that even though McCartney 1 is not the most polished album, it's not the most well-recorded or produced album ever, it gives you this feeling of intimacy and privacy that very few other albums in the entire history of music will give you. And unlike it happened with the other Beatles in their albums, I feel like in this one you're actually listening to McCartney becoming a solo artist, trying to figure out what he wanted from music, and for me that feeling was beautiful and magical and really hard to explain, so you're just gonna have to believe me and give the album a try.
Well, now this is a first. Never done this before, but how exciting is this on the internet? Okay, this is going to be a recipe for mashed potatoes.
And that is going to be it for today's video. I really hope that you guys enjoyed. If you did, go ahead and leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any other videos that I upload. If you want me to talk about any other topics related to music, if you want me to check out an album, a song, or an artist, leave it down below as well, and I'll make sure to read it and fulfill your request as soon as I can. Once again, I hope that you enjoyed, and I hope that I can see you soon with a new video. But until then, bye.